In the summer of 2008, as the August bank holiday draws to a close, a family return home from a friend's barbecue.
Chris was happy and joking, and he was absolutely fine. No indications whatsoever.
Hours later, all three members of the family would be dead, and their mansion completely engulfed in flames.
It was like something out of a movie. It was unbelievable.
The cause of the fire and just how the family met their deaths would stun the nation.
Whether it was planned or something more impulsive, we may never know.
It was a crime that shook Britain. In the early hours of the 26th of August 2008, Osbaston House near Oswestry in Shropshire, the palatial home of multi-millionaire Christopher Foster and his family, was devastated by a massive fire that completely destroyed the house and several of the outbuildings.
The scale of the damage caused to this country home is clear from the air.
The fire service released images quite shortly after, just taken from the courtyard, and every window is bright orange. It is quite an image.
Because of the severity of the fire, especially in the main house, the chances of survival within there were essentially nil.
Emergency crews raced to the scene, alerted by worried neighbours. But as soon as they arrived, they realised immediately that they weren't dealing with an ordinary house fire.
The first call was made by neighbours to the emergency services to say they'd seen the fire, and by that stage it had already taken hold.
The property itself was a fairly large property. The fire, being fully involved on the ground and first floor when the incident commander first got there, would have been coming out of the windows. So a very well ventilated fire, so lots of flames and lots of smoke coming off it. And I believe it was the sound of the fire that actually alerted the neighbours to the existence of the fire in the first place.
The fire service were first on the scene and were greeted by the electronic gates, which were closed. The other side of those gates was the family's horse box, and the tyres were shot out on that lorry, making it impossible for the emergency service to get through, so the fire engines couldn't actually get through those gates until that was moved.
Being so near to a raging inferno, but being powerless to stop it, and blocked from getting fire engines close enough to fight the fire, was devastating for the emergency services at the scene.
It was so deliberate. As soon as you could see that the tyres had been blown out and there was no keys in the ignition, it was deliberately there in the driveway. It was narrow enough. You could have just about got the horse box through the gate posts, but there was no way you were ever going to get any appliance, or you would have even struggled. You were struggling just to carry a small portable pump through the gateway and get it up the side.
For them to be at the gates to see what's going on, knowing there could be bodies in there, and I know the police said at the time how frustrating it was for them, because at the end of the day, if that is a crime scene, that evidence has gone. But everybody would have been thinking, is there anybody inside?
When the fire crews eventually managed to get water onto the flames, the sheer scale of the devastation began to emerge. The three-storey main house was completely destroyed, along with stables and garages. There was no sign of the Foster family, but the fire crews were beginning to realise that the fire was not an accident.
I think there were signs of blood trails found from the kennel leading to the stables, and there were signs of gun cartridges on the ground as well. And this brings a whole different feeling to the incident, that we're not just talking with a potential arsonist, but perhaps something far more serious and far more evil than that.
When you see the damage and the carnage that has been caused, I mean, when they say about things being razed to the ground, the property itself, the shell of the main building was there, but the floors, the floors had dropped in. And when you looked at the garage and the stable block, I mean, they were literally just razed to the ground.
The fact it was so ferocious, it wasn't a fire that had started very small and was still small when the fire service got there. It had taken hold. It was huge. So it was obvious something had gone terribly wrong. But the question was, what had gone wrong? And I don't think, to this day, anybody could have predicted what transpired after that.
Osbaston House was located in the quiet Shropshire village of Maesbrook, near Oswestry. some 60 miles northwest of Birmingham, a sprawling 16-acre estate, complete with a lake and riding paddocks. It was most people's idea of a dream home.
Oh, it was, yeah. Yeah, it was an amazing place. He spent an awful lot of money on it. You know, he paid 1.15 million for it, and it needed an awful lot doing. I mean, he spent 50,000 on the landscaping. He put a big pool in there and stocked it with trout. Had outbuildings, stables built for the horses, menage fencing, everything. Really went to town on it. Just money, no object.
Multi-millionaire businessman Christopher Foster bought Osbaston House in 2004 after seeing it featured in a magazine.
Jill had been shopping in Sainsbury's and she'd picked up I think it was the Shropshire Life, and in there was a house that she'd fell in love with. They went the next morning and Chris put in an offer that very same day in the afternoon. He said, "We want to buy this house. It ticks the boxes." And they proceeded at that. They sold their house almost within the next couple of days.
The purchase of Osbaston House was typical of Christopher Foster, very much the self-made man with the world at his feet, who loved to spend money on the finer things in life. However, behind the grand gestures, all was not as it seemed with Foster and his finances.
I think he overstretched himself at that time. I think he did, and I think a lot of that went through the business, a lot of the expenditure, and he didn't seem to care. He just, right, that's what I want. Yeah, well, I haven't got quite enough. Well, I'll take it out of the business. And I think he might have been somewhat misled as well, exactly what he could and couldn't do. I think he was somewhat naive regarding how much he could take out.
Despite his disreputable business practices, at home it would appear that Foster worshipped his family.
From all the photographs that we see, and you know, the holidays abroad, they were a family unit. But I think he also did his own thing as well. He did his shooting, and often did his shooting. And I think he did have time to himself. And Kirsty and Jill used to go off to equestrian events as well. But I think fundamentally, you know, we're told he doted on Kirsty.
Chris Foster owned a successful engineering company that had grown rapidly after Chris developed a revolutionary insulation material for the oil industry.
Chris saw this tremendous opportunity. He saw Piper Alpha in flames and could see this opportunity not just for insulating valves, gas valves on oil rigs and gas rigs for fire protection. And that's where the success came from. I say he put everything into it. He took a risk. I mean, there's one thing Chris was, he was a risk taker. And I think you've got to admire him for that and making it work. He had the intelligence to see that something would happen with it. He'd made a lot of money. I mean, at one point, I know he was bringing product in. He was putting a label on it and sending it out the door and making, you know, 50, 60% plus markup. He was a license to print money, yes.
He went from a turnover of, on the average month, say 50 to 60,000 to $1 million. It's like him winning the lottery.
As his company grew, Chris Foster and his family began to enjoy the benefits of his success.
Oh yes, Chris Foster liked spending money. Very much liked spending money. In fact, you could say he was put on earth to spend money. You could. I think he was starting to live the life he always wanted to live. And he didn't see any reason why he shouldn't have it. Chris was, in fact, he wasn't trying to keep up with the Joneses. He tried to beat the Joneses. I once said, it's a good job he doesn't go to Buckingham Palace, because if the Queen had got one, he'd sure to want one, and he'd probably bankrupt the company. Chris's salary was approximately just short of £10,000 per month, and he could spend up to an extra £15,000 per month. When he moved to Osbaston House, he spent things on new tractors, new trailers, horses, lifestyle. They'd go to parties, he'd go to parties, he'd have parties. Cars, he'd be thinking about what car can I have next. His wife would also spend money. They were both alike in a sense, they could both spend money. And they soon went through it. It was no problem. Chris and Jill, both the same, used to like to have what they called a hot holiday. Chris's favourite place was Mauritius, and Jill's was too. They loved Mauritius. So they would go there and they'd stop in the best hotel, they would have the best of everything, they would have the best flights, they would go first class. Their holidays could be anything up to 16, 18, 20,000 pounds.
Along with the holidays, cars and lavish parties, Chris Foster's other passion in life was shooting.
Oh, Chris was passionate at shooting. He was very good. He enjoyed shooting. You could see the difference in the step in him. These were serious money guns. Chris never paid cheap for a gun. He'd think nothing of paying £12,500 for a gun.
Men collect things. People with firearms licenses invariably have more than one gun. It's what they like, what they do. They maintain them, they service them and clean them. And that's part of what the hobby is about. But why should the gun and the ammunition be kept together? That's where it's at most risk, that's where it's most likely to be stolen, and we get a lot of guns stolen every year, and it's also in the home that it's most likely to be misused by its owner.
Often he would join shoots that started on a Tuesday with a welcoming buffet, and he'd shoot all day on a Wednesday, and then he would come home on the Thursday. Many of these shoots were not local, so of course he would go early on Tuesday and he would spend 3 days away, and they were quite a considerable amount of it would be nothing for him to spend up to £8,000 on a shoot. And yes, he loved shooting.
Despite this lavish lifestyle, which on the surface was perfect, Chris Foster harboured a secret. His business was struggling and bills were mounting up. The fast cars, the dream home and the luxury holidays were seemingly a charade. Foster was drowning in a sea of debt, a fact he had apparently hidden from everybody. And after a bank holiday barbecue with friends, he and his family had seemingly disappeared without trace. But with the fire finally under control, the charred ruins of Osbaston House were about to give up their secrets.
This was a missing person inquiry.
The 3 members of the Foster family remain unaccounted for.
Everybody hoped that the family were on holiday, that they'd fled.
And we are carrying out every possible line of inquiry to trace them.
It was only when the bodies were found, the nature of the inquiry changed, when it was revealed Jill had died from a gunshot wound to the head.
Self-made millionaire Christopher Foster, along with his 49-year-old wife Jill and 15-year-old daughter Kirsty, lived in Osbaston House in rural Shropshire. They enjoyed all the trappings of the luxury lifestyle that Chris's successful business provided. But as a fierce fire ripped through their home in August 2008, no one could have imagined the true horror that hid behind their dream lifestyle.
Chris was a very charismatic character. In some respects, very good with people, very personable with people, good at getting to know people, and could be the life and soul of the party. There was another side to him. He could be quite quick-tempered.
Like everybody, Chris Foster was a person who had different ways, different things. He was different people. He was very kind, he was very nice, but at the same time he could turn.
Foster was born in Burnley, Lancashire in 1958. He, along with his mother and father and younger brother Andrew, moved to the Midlands 5 years later, where he would go on to start a career in sales. Chris married his wife Jill in 1987, and just over a year later, he began his own company.
My mum said he was very ruthless in business to me once. And I think it was just that's where he knew where he wanted to go, and nobody was going to get in the way, and he went for it. And I know one guy who particularly works for him said that the Chris Foster that he knew as a friend was very different to the Chris Foster that he worked for.
In anything Chris did, he liked to come first. in all competitions. When he shot, he liked to shoot this many more pheasants than anybody else. When he fished, he liked to catch more fish than anybody else. He was, in that way, a very competitive man.
Joe used to say he was a control freak. Yeah, he had to be in control of things, totally.
He was that type of person. And yes, he was very, very competitive.
Christopher Foster's competitive nature led to his company growing beyond all expectations. The success, however, began to affect the businessman.
It changed him, as money does change some people. Chris, in a sense, I wouldn't say that he couldn't handle money, but he needed help handling money, particularly that quantity and value of money. I think he probably needed help. I don't think in the beginning Chris was greedy. He might have been slightly greedy, as any businessman is, but he became rather greedy, very greedy in fact. And every penny he could get his hands on, he spent.
This is one of the difficulties, that enough was never enough for him, and he got to a certain point that he was, obviously wealthy, making good money, but it wasn't enough, and he wanted more, and the impression I get is that he wanted more and more as it went along. And even when he ended up with Osbaston and 16 acres and £1.1 million worth of property around him, that it didn't seem enough. He didn't seem to, for all his success and all the possessions or whatever go with it, he didn't seem to be particularly happy with it all. No matter how much he spent, he didn't seem to achieve happiness through it.
It would also appear that Christopher Foster's relationship with his wife, Jill, was also under strain.
Chris and Jill's relationship wasn't all happy families, I'm afraid. I think they'd probably come to the end and they kind of lived their own separate lives. One day I couldn't get him, and it was an urgent call. And when he come back in the office, I said to him, "I've been calling you, Chris." He said, "It's very urgent, you've got a very urgent call." So he said to me, "Ring my phone again, because it's on." He said, "And it's been with me." So it didn't ring. So he looked at it closely and he said, "Gosh," he said, "I've picked Jill's up because they were both the same." So he placed a call to Jill, and his words were, "If any of your boyfriends ring, I'll give them my number, and if any of my girlfriends ring, you give them your number." Now, I found that rather strange. So perhaps that's the marriage that they had, open.
Since the terrible events at Osbaston House, it has also emerged that as a teenager, Christopher Foster was abusive to his younger brother.
I had a difficult relationship with Chris. He was obviously always the older brother, and he was a forceful character. And I suppose at the age of 11, he was 5 years older than me, and he started to sexually abuse me. I didn't think about it for many years. It's funny how sort of sometimes you deal with these things, you sort of don't quite realise what's happened, and you put things to your back of your mind, and then it was many years later it sort of came back and I realised what had happened, really.
You've got a dominant form of masculinity which is absolutely heterosexual, powerful, etc. Other masculinities are measured against that and found wanting. So for a man who is very much in the world as very publicly a heterosexual married man, etc., if there is another side to his personality that he hasn't been able to share and that people are not aware of, and that perhaps is threatened with exposure, then clearly that's another element of his public persona which is going to be lost.
Till death us do part.
Till death do us part.
I think that he couldn't really be the person that he wanted to be. He was seen to be this very heterosexual male who drove fast cars and went shooting and, very successful. So it must have been a real conflict in his mind.
The turmoil in Christopher Foster's private life was compounded by an ever-growing crisis at work. In 2004, he was worth over £10 million on paper at least. Just 3 years later, he would owe the Inland Revenue almost £1 million in unpaid taxes and was on the verge of losing control of his own company and a financial meltdown. A text message from a friend sent at the time revealed how desperate Foster's situation actually was.
A colleague texted him in the July before asking if he was okay, and Chris had replied and said, "Not really, I think everything's coming to a head for me."
It would appear that by the August of 2008, Christopher Foster had nowhere left to turn, but was still able to keep up the pretense of a happy family man at a friend's barbecue.
They spend the afternoon, Chris is shooting clays, all afternoon, clay pigeon shooting. And he says to Jill, "I've had enough, I want to go home." And Jill doesn't want to go home. He says, oh no, I'm tired, I've got to go back. And they return back to Osbaston house in Jill's black Range Rover.
It seemed like a normal family thing to do. When you get home late, you go to bed. Kirsty, as teenagers do, was on MSN to a friend and said that she had to go because her dad was turning the internet off. And obviously the evidence was there of that MSN conversation. And then, because the internet went off, Kirsty then sent a text to that friend to say, "Sorry, my dad turned the internet off, night-night." And that was the last Kirsty was heard of.
What happened in the next few hours at Osbaston House would stun the nation, as all the evidence found at the scene pointed to a terrible conclusion. Kirsty and Jill had been murdered, their house destroyed, and police believed only one person was responsible. In August 2008, a huge fire ripped through Osbaston House, the mansion owned by millionaire Christopher Foster, his wife Jill, and daughter Kirsty. Friends and relatives' worst fears were realized when 3 bodies were found in the ruins of the house, but nothing could have prepared them for the awful truth of what actually happened on the night of the blaze.
A forensics tent shields the spot where the bodies were recovered.
The family had returned home from a barbecue, and it appears that Jill went to bed, followed by Kirsty, who spent time chatting to friends online. Soon after midnight, she too went to bed. Nothing is seen of Chris Foster until 3:09 a.m, when he appears on the house's CCTV camera.
I think he's walking up the drive, and you can see an image of the gun. It appears to me to be quite a premeditated act. It's got to have been, because there's a degree of organisation to it. It's systematic. He goes to the stables, the horses are tethered. You can see him pull the lead ropes off the big horse Rowley. He's leaning back and straining against the rope to pull him up to the stable door. And he's got the gun on the floor. I think he put some ammunition into the gun. And then you can see him stand up. You can't see the gun that clear, but stand back and shoot the horse.
The footage was unbelievable, really. You couldn't believe what you were watching, and within the inquest, it was absolutely silent. You could see what he was doing, and it was like something out of a movie. It was unbelievable.
He goes up and gets the horse box, drives it down to the front gate, and then he goes out of shot, reappears, and he must be pouring, he goes to the top of the barns, and he must be pouring accelerant into the barns to set those on fire. But it's this systematic approach to everything. It's either Chris making a statement and saying, "It's all going, no, he's having a thing," or somebody saying, "Yeah, I'm going to show you, you can't cross me, you know, and this is, I'm going to show everybody, if you cross me, this is what happens."
As chilling as the CCTV was, the coroner's inquest would conclude that before killing his animals and setting the fire, Christopher Foster had committed an unthinkable act. He had shot his wife Jill before crossing the hall to Kirsty's room and turning the gun on her. The inquest revealed that both Jill and Kirsty were likely to have been asleep when they died. After heading outside to start the fire and being captured on CCTV, Chris Foster went back inside, spreading accelerant and oil-soaked rags throughout the house to ensure the fire would take hold.
He must have gone back through the kitchen, up the back stairs, through his dressing room, through the bathroom, back into the bedroom. So he lay down on the bed and the fire took him because there wasn't sufficient smoke inhalation to kill him. So the fire killed him. Well, that was his punishment. But he punished himself.
4 days after the fire, the still smouldering ruins of Osbaston House finally revealed the truth when the first bodies were recovered by the police.
Detectives investigating the arson and murders at Osbaston House, Maysbrook, in the early hours of August the 26th, believe that Jill and Kirsty Foster were killed by Christopher Foster.
Jill and Christopher's bodies were found on the Friday.
They were found by the fireplace by the forensic guys, but they were top to tail. They'd fallen through the floors, entwined in the bed, right the way, because it was a three-storey house, right the way through.
It wasn't until the Sunday, and the news transpired on the Monday, that Kirsty's body had been found, or the remains of a third body, later confirmed as Kirsty. When we were told the animals had been shot, then that pretty much concluded it, that there was nobody else involved and something terrible had happened and he had killed his family and set fire to the property and then killed himself.
As a human being, as a father and as a husband, it does make you question how does somebody come to that position in their life that they feel they have to do those actions to their loved ones. It really does make you question that. And it stays with you. That's an incident that I think will stay with me throughout my life.
The awful case of Christopher Foster echoes types of perpetrators that have been termed by researchers in the USA as family annihilators.
I suppose it's an unfortunate shorthand for this phenomenon in which a person kills their entire family and then themselves. In England and Wales, it represents about 6% of homicides overall. So happily, it is a rare phenomenon, but clearly it's a very devastating one.
Studies of homicide-suicides have shown a clear pattern of characteristics in men who carry out this type of crime, allowing researchers to create a profile of a typical offender.
The domestic homicide perpetrator is more likely to be like the ordinary guy. He's more likely to be, if you like, respectable in some ways, slightly more educated in employment, etc. And they are men with a great deal to lose, a great deal invested in their relationships, jobs, homes, children. And this terrible event of homicide followed by suicide is frequently triggered by events which are causing them to lose those important things in their lives.
It would appear that Christopher Foster was indeed on the verge of losing everything. Inquiries after the blaze revealed quite how dire his financial situation actually was.
It transpired that the bailiffs actually arrived on the Tuesday at Osbaston House following the fire to serve a notice, and then the real financial picture came out during the inquest.
Foster's road to financial ruin began early in his business life, when his compulsive spending was coupled with an aversion to paying income tax.
Chris hated the taxman with vengeance. He always used to say they waste the tax on various things that's stupid. He wouldn't mind so much if they put it to good use. But he didn't think they put it to good use. And he didn't see why he should work and scrimp and scrape to give them stuff to waste.
As well as not paying tax, Foster, along with his accountant, concocted a plan where they would raise invoices to draw money from the company to fund the lavish lifestyle the Foster family were living.
He created an invoice for about approximately £1 million, and it was for services and advice, financial advice, ongoing for Mr. and Mrs. Foster. And when each piece of advice they consulted on, it was put to this invoice. But it was really to cover Chris's expenditure. He needed to keep raising capital so that he could spend it. his lifestyle had become to a place where it was not going to be sustainable. Somebody was sooner or later going to catch up with him. He wasn't paying any VAT or any national insurance or any tax on his expenditure. He was just spending it. I did say on quite a few occasions, Chris, you need to be careful. That, you know, the taxman always catches people, and his reply was, he's got to get up early to catch me.
Shortly afterwards, Foster's problems were compounded when he found himself in a legal dispute with his supplier.
I think the difficulties started during the breach of contract dispute that he had. He was found that he was sourcing product from an alternative supplier, and he breached the contract with the current supplier.
Faced with massive legal costs and damages to pay, Foster decided to liquidate the company, and he quietly began to transfer the assets to a new business. He was found out, and a judge labelled him bereft of commercial morality.
He was rigorously pursued for breach of contract, and unfortunately lost that case. He was badly advised as well, and I think the side of his personality that he wasn't going to let anybody take it away from him because he'd worked hard for it and achieved it, kicked in quite strongly as well. He made things quite difficult for the liquidator.
Records held by Companies House show that Foster's business was placed in compulsory liquidation in September 2007. A month later, he was ordered to sever all links with the company, including giving up his salary. Chris Foster was facing financial ruin.
There was disputes over title to ownership to buildings and freezing orders put against the property. He couldn't sell anything. So that's when it really started to unravel, and the cracks started to appear.
For everybody who has
Oh, there's no getting away from him, was it? He was in a desperate place. Yes, yeah. You know, he'd run out of corners to turn to, really.
Independent accountants were called in to look at Foster's books, and they were quick to tell the staff in quite how much trouble the company was in.
A senior accountant had to take over. He came to visit and took me into the office, which was the works office downstairs, and said to me, you do realise that this company is in major and has major problems, and it's going to take a lot to get it out of problems.
The mounting pressure on Foster and the impending loss of his business and lifestyle would have appeared to have acted as a trigger for the awful events that would follow.
When men are very much in that mode of feeling that they are performing well and that their life has been successful and that they have achieved a great deal and that they are very invested in that, if something threatens to remove all that and to totally undermine all that, then for some men, that loss of power and control will lead to them expressing themselves in this extreme form of violence. And it seems to be a way, I know it's perverse, but it seems to be a way of regaining some control in that final act of having decided to kill themselves, then killing their partners or their children. It's regaining that control. It's like saying, if I can't have all of this, if I can't have my beloved wife and child, and if I can't have my business and my beautiful home, then no one else is going to have them.
I believe Chris, and probably Jill to some extent, had got on a merry-go-round. And that merry-go-round was going round and round and round, and the faster it was going round and round, the more he was sinking. He couldn't sustain the lifestyle that he had. He didn't have enough money, and it was going to come to an end. Everything like that would come to an end, and it was only a matter of time. If he'd have been a little bit more sensible, he'd have still been there today.
In the months after the terrible events at Osbaston House, it emerged that there were in fact warning signs of the impending devastation, signs that were tragically missed.
He said to colleagues, look after Kirsty and Jill. I'm gonna top myself. Look after them for me. But they didn't say anything to anybody. They just thought he was joking.
Millionaire Christopher Foster killed his wife and daughter before setting fire to their home in August 2008. The brutal events shocked the nation as press and public alike clamoured to understand why Foster had committed this terrible crime.
The biggest question on everybody's lips was, why did he do it? Why did it happen?
I do try and understand why he may have done it. I think of all the connotations. You think, the personal relationship side with Jill. Perhaps they come back that night from the barbecue. They argue. Jill said, he shows her the bailiff's note. I've had enough. Jill says, I can't take any more. I'm leaving with Kirsty. And I thought, was that the one thing that could have taken him over the edge? Because he'd lost absolutely everything then.
The finances came up time and time again. And then people often said, why did he have to take his wife and daughter as well? Why couldn't he just take himself?
So here you have a person who's already decided, a settled intention to kill themselves. And having done that, that person is then free to commit the other acts of violence and homicide that they then go on to commit. I've termed this suicidal abrogation, i.e. the abrogation of their previous, in many of these men's cases, their previous totally law-abiding status. And yet, in deciding that they need to go and they need to die, that decision frees them from then any consequences from the law. They don't need to fear the police, the courts. They don't need to fear the bailiffs. They are free to go on and kill the other people that they're going to kill. I have seen some of the CCTV footage, and you can see Mr. Foster very calmly going about his preparations when he was in the act of this crime. And it's because they're their only judge then. They know they're going to kill themselves, so no one else matters at this point.
Another factor that may have played a part in Foster's actions that night was his perceived loss of status, the businessman that apparently had it all and lost it.
We don't have any evidence to think that he wanted to punish his wife in any way, and certainly not his daughter. So therefore, the alternative reading is one in which he doesn't want to leave them with the consequences of really his failure.
He perhaps didn't want Kirsty to lose the lifestyle that she was accustomed to. But then obviously people that know Kirsty would have preferred her to be with us today, regardless of the finances.
The society that we live in is driven geared towards success, isn't it? I mean, we're all judged by where we live and, how much we earn and what we drive. At the end of the day, it's just stuff. It doesn't mean anything.
Compounding these issues was Foster's apparent isolation. Few people appear to have any idea about the scale of Foster's financial meltdown.
Some of the research that's been done on suicide alone, looking at men and their greater susceptibility to suicide, one of the theories that's been put forward is just that because men are less likely to seek emotional support, then they are at a greater risk of suicide. And so, in a way, it's not surprising that afterwards people say, well, we didn't know, because someone like Christopher Foster, who was very much the high-flying person with very much the trappings of success. Look at that home, it was so luxurious, and everybody thought, why would a person with all that destroy it in such a way? But for him, that impending loss of all that, it's as though to reveal that to other people and to share that would be to show that weakness. It cuts them off from the ability to get that support from other people, and I suppose indeed makes this phenomenon more likely.
The strain Foster was under was also having a detrimental effect on his mental health.
At the inquest, it was revealed that Christopher had been to the doctors in the weeks prior to the fire and he'd actually been on antidepressants since the March, I think it was, before the fire was in the August, and the doctor asked if he'd had any suicidal thoughts, and he admitted he did.
I've got the medical notes. GP said he made good eye contact, he appeared to be rational, he was planning a holiday as well. But he prescribed him a drug called Zispin. And that to me is the first indications that Chris had got that time, the rational state of mind to realise that, you know, he was getting depressed with things. He'd said to the doctor that he'd got business difficulties, and he hadn't discussed it with Jill at that time. He was bottling everything, and he got nobody to talk to.
It was also revealed in the inquest that on the day of the fire, the day prior to the fire, he had been online to look at suicidal websites. And there was questions raised at the time through the coroner whether somebody that held a gun licence and had suicidal thoughts should not have been investigated further or referred further.
There are important questions about the role of medical professionals in alerting the authorities to people who might present a danger. And that goes back to one of the Gun Control Network recommendations, that there ought to be a database into which GP information could be fed, so that if the police get information that someone who's known to have a stash of firearms is acting erratically, getting drunk a lot, or of course if their mental health is flagging, that ought to send alarm bells. And you have to put those two bits of information together. There could be a mental health database, there is a firearms ownership database. You put that together and people could take action to deal with this emerging risk.
People have got a shotgun licence and can have a number of shotguns as well. They can have a firearms licence. And they're checked, I think they're checked every 5 years, the licences are checked. But what happens in that 5 years? Anything can happen, can't it? There's a large proportion of the population treated for depression. So what happens within that 5 years?
Sometimes the licensing check or the sort of 5 yearly visit by the licensing officer is utterly cursory. It's no more than a courtesy call, have a quick look, and then tick the box, renew the licence. But in some cases it's much more diligent. The security arrangements are checked, more than one officer might attend, there might be a kind of interview, but that's just a face-to-face interaction and a sight of the gun cabinet, for instance. What's needed is more information about the mental health of the person.
The Foster family were laid to rest on the 19th of December 2008. The decision was taken by relatives to hold separate funerals, one for Kirsty and Jill, and another service, a few hours later, for Christopher.
The first funeral was of Kirsty and Jill. The two coffins arrived in the hearse together, and there was about 150 people, some packed into the village church and many standing outside. Teenagers obviously breaking down in tears. But that was a service that will stay with me forever, because the silence, you say a place comes to a standstill, it literally came to a standstill. And you could have heard a pin drop within the village. It was very poignant.
The site of Osbaston House, the scene of the awful tragedy, has since been cleared and is now up for sale, complete with planning permission for another 3-storey mansion.
I suppose I look at it now, I suppose I say it's our sort of ground zero, because it's just been totally flattened and re-landscaped. The original footprint is there for the stables and the garages. The barn's still there at the back of the house. I used to go there quite often and just wander about, really. It's very peaceful. Sounds strange, but it's very peaceful. When I go there, Kirsty's still, yeah, very much there in spirit, I feel, as they all are, I think.
Despite years thinking about the terrible events at Osbaston House, Christopher Foster's relatives still struggle to come to terms with his actions that August night.
I do have very conflicting emotions, yes. Yes, about it. It's difficult from perspective that we didn't manage to get things straightened out between us. Things could have been very different. I suppose I feel myself if things had been different, I might have been able to help him.